Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today we're tackling Ray Dalio,
Oh, yeah.
specifically his new book, talking about how countries go broke,
Right.
which, kind of dovetails with a lot of his prior work, like thinking about the big cycle
Hmm.
and empires rising and falling. As a U.S. investor, as a U.S. citizen, I mean, this is something that
Really hits home.
really hits home. Yeah. So, Dalio, just briefly, is a legendary investor.
Oh, yeah. He started when he was 12 years old,
Yeah.
founded Bridgewater, the biggest hedge fund in the world.
So he's somebody we should probably pay attention to.
Definitely.
So what we really want to cover in this deep dive is, from a U.S. perspective,
Huh?
what are the big things we should be thinking about? And, is the U.S. empire going to dominate the globe forever?
Well, we hope so.
Well, we hope so, right?
Right.
But will it?
Yeah.
And if not, is China the heir apparent?
Right. Yeah.
And if they were to take the reins, what would that transition look like?
Right.
And what can we as investors in the U.S. do to kind of protect ourselves through that transition?
Yeah.
So I think, a great place to start is to talk about, Dalio's big cycle
Yeah.
concept. What is that? How does it apply to empires throughout history?
Yeah. So Dalio's big cycle is basically this recurring pattern he's identified where empires rise to power, they reach a peak, and then they eventually decline. And typically this plays out over about 75 to 100 years.
Hmm.
And he identifies 5 key forces that are at work throughout history shaping these cycles.
Okay, let's hear it. What are those 5?
So there's debt cycles,
Oh, yeah.
periods of borrowing, lending, that can either fuel growth or lead to instability.
Sure.
There's internal order and disorder. So that's,
Yeah.
how unified a society is, how well it can address its challenges.
Okay.
And of course, there's external conflicts like wars and geopolitical rivalries, which
Right.
can really disrupt things. Acts of nature, so, pandemics, natural disasters.
Hmm.
And then finally, and perhaps most importantly today, there's technological innovation. Empires can either be propelled forward by technology or fall behind.
Right.
And that's a big one today.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are some of the signs if you're looking at an empire and trying to decide, where they are in this cycle? What are some of the red flags that Dalio highlights that suggest, maybe they're on the decline?
Yeah. He points to a few things. One is rising internal conflict. A lot of polarization, tension within society that weakens a nation from the inside. Excessive debt.
Sure.
When an empire becomes burdened by debt, that limits its ability to maneuver.
Absolutely.
And of course, slowdown in innovation is a key sign. If
Yeah.
you fall behind technologically, that has major consequences. And then, of course, the emergence of a rival power, a challenger on the world stage.
Right.
That's always a sign that an empire might be entering its twilight years.
And I'm sure there are plenty of people listening who are saying, wait a minute, a lot of that sounds familiar.
Hmm.
So I think it's probably time to talk about where the U.S. is in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
What does Dalio's framework suggest about, the state of the American empire?
Yeah. So Dalio's take on the U.S. is really interesting. He sees strengths, but he also points to some concerning trends
Right.
that align with his big cycle framework. He highlights, increasing political polarization in the U.S.,
Sure.
growing wealth gaps,
Yeah.
and of course, our mounting national debt.
Which is substantial. And there's one statistic that I think really jumped out at me when I was reading his work, and I'm sure will surprise a lot of listeners, which is that he estimates that there's a 30% chance of civil war in the U.S. within the next decade.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark number.
Yeah. So how does he arrive at that, and how does that fit into his overall, analysis of the U.S.?
Yeah. It's important to emphasize that, Dalio's not a fortune teller.
Right.
He's not saying this is definitely going to happen.
Yeah.
But he's looking at historical patterns. And he sees this connection, between rising internal tensions, economic instability, and the potential for conflict.
Right.
He's not saying it lightly, but he's identifying it as a risk factor that seems to be growing in the U.S.
So is he saying that, the U.S. is doomed? Or is there hope? Can we turn things around?
Yeah, Dalio's work, he's always very clear that decline is not inevitable.
Right.
He sees a path forward for the U.S., but it requires, taking action, addressing these challenges.
So what does he suggest? What are some of the things that the U.S. can do to maybe lengthen its time at the top of, the global power structure?
Yeah. So he argues that, the U.S. needs to foster innovation.
Mm.
We need to be investing in key technologies, things like artificial intelligence.
Right.
And we need to be projecting soft power, through cultural influence and diplomacy. He also believes that modernizing the military is critical to maintain a credible deterrent in a world that's becoming increasingly, complicated.
Yeah.
And he also emphasizes the need for what he calls adaptive diplomacy.
Okay, so what is that?
So it's basically, the ability to navigate these complex geopolitical shifts, to build strategic alliances, and to really be flexible and responsive to the changing global landscape.
Right. So it's not just about hard power. It's about being smart, being strategic, being able to build relationships and alliances.
Exactly.
Okay. So there's, potentially a path forward for the U.S. But let's face it, there's another really big player on the world stage that's nipping at our heels.
Right.
And that's China.
Right. Yeah.
And, Dalio very clearly identifies China as the most likely successor to the U.S. if the U.S. were to decline.
Right.
So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about China.
Yeah.
What does he say about their strengths and their ambitions?
Yeah. Well, first of all, he points to China's remarkable economic growth. Over the past few decades, they've really transformed themselves. They've lifted millions of people out of poverty.
Right.
They've built this modern, technologically advanced economy. And they're not just growing economically, they're making strategic moves geopolitically as well.
Yeah, I mean, what are some of those moves that they're making?
Well, they've been expanding their diplomatic network. They're boosting their foreign aid.
Okay.
And they're actively trying to shape global governance, through institutions like the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
So it's clear that they have, global ambitions. They don't just want to be a regional power.
So it sounds like we're talking about a pretty substantial power shift. If this were to occur, what does Dalio say about how that transition might unfold?
Yeah. He suggests that this transition from a U.S.-led world order to one potentially led by China, it's unlikely to be smooth. He thinks it could be, a period of significant economic and geopolitical volatility.
Right. So can you give us some more concrete examples of what that volatility might look like?
Sure. So, one of the biggest things that could be affected is the U.S. dollar status as the global reserve currency.
Yeah.
That's been a cornerstone of the global financial system for decades.
Right.
And if that were to change, it's really hard to say exactly what would happen. But it could lead to, a more fragmented global economy with competing currency blocks, maybe less stable financial markets. We might see more regional conflicts as countries try to figure out their place in this new world order.
Right. So this is not just some sort of, abstract geopolitical maneuvering. This could have real consequences.
Absolutely. Yeah. It could affect, people's lives, their livelihoods.
Right.
And that's why, it's important to understand these forces at play.
Absolutely. So we've kind of talked about, the U.S. maybe trying to extend its time at the top.
Right.
We've talked about China's ambitions to take over that role.
Right.
But I think it's helpful to get a little bit more specific.
Yeah.
What is China actually doing? What are some of the concrete steps that they're taking to accelerate their rise?
Yeah. Dalio outlines several approaches in his work. One is, achieving regional primacy in Asia. So basically, solidifying their influence in their own backyard before they expand further. They're also focused on building global influence, to kind of outmaneuver the U.S., both economically and diplomatically. And, they're not shy about taking advantage of any weaknesses they see in the U.S.
If we step back, they're going to step in.
Right. Dalio points out that, if the U.S. retreats from international commitments, China's often quick to fill that void. They're also, positioning themselves as leaders on issues like climate change, which could really help them build goodwill globally.
It's a smart move,
Yeah.
right? It appeals to a broader audience.
It does, yeah.
It's not just about, regional power plays.
Right.
It's about global leadership.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the competition for information dominance.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, absolutely crucial in today's world. And China is investing heavily in, AI, 5G networks.
Right.
They want to control the flow of information.
Right.
And they want to set the global standards.
So they're playing the long game. They're really thinking about how to shape the future.
They are, yeah. And it's, it's pretty impressive to see their ambition.
So I think, the big question everybody wants to know is who's winning?
Right.
Is China inevitably going to overtake the U.S.? Or does the U.S. still have a fighting chance to maintain its position as the top dog?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And, it's impossible to say for sure, but, Dalio does offer some thoughts on who might have the edge right now.
Okay, so who does he think is doing a better job?
Well, he points to a few things that suggest, maybe China's gaining an advantage. Their economy has been incredibly resilient, even through things like the COVID pandemic. They bounced back very quickly.
They did.
And their global influence continues to grow. They're also making a lot of progress in key technological areas,
Yeah.
like AI and 5G. And they have this ambitious plan called China Standards 2035,
Right,
which is all about setting, the standards for next generation technology.
Right. So that's a direct challenge to the U.S., which has always kind of been the leader in those areas.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it sounds like, China is doing a lot of things right, but, they're not without their own challenges, right? I mean, they've got to have some internal issues that they're facing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. China has its own set of challenges. They've got a growing debt bubble of their own.
Okay.
They're dealing with issues like income inequality, environmental problems.
Right.
So, it's not a guaranteed path to global leadership for them either.
Right. There are always internal and external factors that can influence,
Yeah.
an empire's trajectory.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's what makes this whole topic so interesting.
Right. So I think it's probably time to bring this back down to earth a little bit
Yeah.
and talk about, you, the listener.
Right.
You're listening to this and you're probably wondering, okay, this is all very interesting, but what does it mean for me?
Yeah.
What does it mean for my money?
Yeah.
So I think that's really where Dalio's insights become, really valuable. He's not just offering this fascinating historical analysis.
Right.
He's providing a framework for understanding how these global shifts
Yeah.
could impact your financial well-being
Absolutely.
and what steps you can take to protect yourself.
Yeah.
So let's get into that. What does he suggest? What should U.S. investors be doing right now to prepare for this potential global transition? What are the key takeaways?
Yeah. Well, one of the things he really emphasizes is diversification.
Oh, yeah. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And that means, not just diversifying across different asset classes, but also thinking about global diversification. Looking at both the U.S. and Chinese markets.
Okay.
But being mindful of the risks and opportunities in each.
Okay. So, yeah, don't just stick with what you know.
Huh.
Broaden your horizons, look around the world, and, spread your bets a little bit.
Right. And, he also stresses the need to really understand how money, credit, and debt cycles work.
Yeah.
It's not just about numbers, it's about human behavior, psychology, the choices that people make under different economic conditions.
Right. So it's not just about, what's happening. It's about why it's happening.
Yeah.
What are the underlying forces that are driving these trends?
Yeah. And Dalio believes that if you understand these forces, you can make more informed investment decisions.
Yeah.
And you're less likely to get caught up in, emotional reactions to short-term market fluctuations.
Right. I feel like those knee-jerk reactions are what really get people in trouble.
They often are, yeah.
You panic, you sell everything when the market dips, and then you miss the rebound.
Right. Yeah.
So I think, that's a really key point, that knowledge is power when it comes to investing.
It really is, yeah.
So any other specific strategies that Dalio recommends?
Yeah. He talks about the importance of paying attention to what he calls the most important number in the financial world.
Okay.
And it's a little bit technical.
Yeah. Lay it on us.
But it's really helpful in understanding investment opportunities. And it's called real bond yield.
Okay. So for the layperson out there, real bond yield, it sounds intimidating.
It does.
What does that really mean? Break it down for us.
Yeah. So basically, think about it this way. You're deciding, do I want to invest in a bond or do I want to buy some real estate? Understanding real bond yield can help you compare those two options and see which one is really going to give you a better return after you factor in inflation.
So it's not just about the stated return on the investment. It's about how much that return is actually worth
Right.
after inflation eats away at it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, real bond yield is this key indicator that helps you assess that.
So we really need to be paying attention to inflation
Yeah.
and how it can impact our investment returns.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any other key concepts from Dalio's work that, you think are really important for investors to kind of wrap their heads around?
Yeah. He also talks about something called beautiful deleveraging,
Okay.
which, it sounds like a good thing.
It does.
but it can actually be quite risky for investors.
Okay. So tell us what that is. Why is it something that we should be aware of?
Yeah. So think of it kind of like, using one credit card to pay off another credit card. It might feel good in the short term, but you're not really solving the problem. You're just shifting debt around.
Right.
And you might even be making it worse in the long run.
Right.
So that's kind of what happens with beautiful deleveraging. Central banks, they print money to try to alleviate a debt crisis.
Right.
And that can, provide some temporary relief.
Yeah.
But the problem is that printing more money often leads to currency devaluation and inflation.
Right. So it's kind of a hidden tax
It is.
that eats away at your wealth
Right.
over time.
Yeah. And so it's another example of how, Dalio's insights can help you see beyond the headlines
Yeah.
and understand what's really driving the markets.
So we've got diversification, we've got understanding debt cycles, we've got real bond yield, we've got beautiful deleveraging. Any other kind of specific investment strategies that Dalio throws out there?
Yeah. He suggests looking at assets that tend to perform well during periods of inflation. Things like real estate, commodities, gold.
Sure. The classic inflation hedges.
Yeah. And he also, he sees some potential in emerging markets, particularly those that are, benefiting from China's rise.
Okay, so even though, the U.S. may be facing some challenges,
Right.
there are still opportunities for growth
There are, yeah.
in other parts of the world.
And that's another reason why diversification is so important.
Sure. Spread your investments around.
Yeah. Reduce your overall risk.
Okay, so we've got real estate, commodities, gold, emerging markets. Anything else?
Yeah. He also talks about the importance of investing in innovation.
Okay.
He believes that the companies and the countries that are leading the way in things like, AI, biotechnology, renewable energy, those are the ones that are likely to outperform in the long run.
Okay, so it's not just about, picking individual stocks. It's about identifying those big trends, those mega trends
Right.
that are really shaping the future.
Yeah. And that's where Dalio's big picture perspective can be really helpful.
Right. So, we've talked about a lot of stuff here. We've talked about diversification, inflation hedges,
Right.
investing in innovation.
Right.
But I think there's one more big elephant in the room that we need to address, and that's the future of the U.S. dollar.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we mentioned before, Dalio doesn't explicitly say in his work whether he believes the dollar's dominance is truly ending or not.
Right.
So as an investor, how do you approach that?
Yeah. That's a tough one. It's kind of like trying to predict the weather,
Right.
Months in advance. There are so many variables at play.
Sure.
But one thing that Dalio emphasizes is having a plan for different scenarios.
Yep.
What if the dollar does lose its reserve currency
Right.
status?
Yeah.
How would you adjust your portfolio?
Good.
Think about those things in advance, kind of have a contingency plan.
You have a plan B
Right.
if things don't go the way we expect, which, who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah.
We're in uncharted territory in a lot of ways.
We are.
But, Dalio reminds us that, periods of great change also present opportunities,
They do. Yeah.
for those who are, prepared and willing to adapt.
Absolutely.
So I think that's really the key takeaway here is, we need to be informed.
Yeah.
We need to be adaptable.
Yeah.
We need to be strategic in our approach to investing.
Absolutely.
And I think Dalio's work really provides a framework for doing that.
It does. Yeah.
Okay. So I think this is a good place to pause for today. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored Dalio's big cycle concept.
Right.
We've examined the potential for, this power shift from the U.S. to China.
Yeah.
And we've talked about some initial investment strategies to consider.
Yeah.
And in the next part of our deep dive, we're going to continue this conversation. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into, the potential implications of this global transition for U.S. investors.
Right.
And we'll explore some more specific strategies for, protecting your wealth, growing your wealth in this changing world.
Yeah.
So stick around.
We'll be right back.
We'll be right back.
So I think now you're probably wondering, how do I make sense of all of this?
Yeah.
As a U.S. investor? Dalio's work it can be kind of heady. You're looking through a telescope at history.
Right.
But how does it actually apply to your portfolio today?
Right. It's easy to get caught up in those, big sweeping narratives of empires rising and falling.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we're trying to figure out how to apply this to our own lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Dalio does that I think is so valuable is he gives us this understanding of cyclical patterns.
Right.
He's not saying he can predict the future. Nobody can.
Right.
But he does believe that by studying the past, we can better anticipate the range of possibilities.
Sure. So let's talk about some of those possibilities.
Yeah.
What are some of the specific scenarios that Dalio kind of lays out that investors should be prepared for?
Well, one scenario he highlights is just the potential for increased volatility in the markets.
Okay.
As this power transition plays out, we could see, more frequent, more dramatic swings in asset prices as investors react to geopolitical events.
So buckle up.
Yeah,
It could be a bumpy ride.
it could be. And that's why, again, having a well-diversified portfolio,
Right.
having a long-term investment strategy, those things are really, really important.
Don't panic. Don't sell everything
Exactly.
Yeah.
Stay the course.
when the market dips.
Uh-huh.
Now, Dalio also talks a lot about the importance of understanding how money and credit cycles work. Why is that so important for investors to grasp?
Yeah. One of Dalio's key insights is that every boom eventually leads to a bust. When credit is cheap and easy to come by, people tend to overborrow.
Sure.
You get asset bubbles, but those bubbles are never sustainable. Eventually the party ends, and then you have what he calls a deleveraging, where debts have to be paid down, asset prices fall, economic activity slows.
So we need to be aware of where we are in those cycles.
Yeah,
And kind of adjust our strategy accordingly.
exactly. So if you think we're, in the late stages of a debt cycle, maybe things are getting a little frothy, you might want to be a little more cautious.
Yeah.
Whereas, if we're in the early stages of a new cycle, there may be, more opportunities for growth.
So the question is, how do you know where you are? I mean, are there signs, are there indicators that you can look at to kind of figure out, are we getting close to the bubble bursting?
Yeah. Dalio points to, several indicators, things like interest rates, inflation levels, consumer debt, government debt.
Sure.
But he also emphasizes that, you have to understand the psychological factors
Right.
that drive these cycles, things like greed and fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Human behavior.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so hard to predict these things. People are unpredictable.
Right. It's not an exact science.
No, it's not.
So, if we can't predict the future perfectly, what's the best way to kind of prepare for these potential shifts?
Yeah, I think Dalio's advice really boils down to, a few key principles. One is diversify your portfolio.
Yeah. Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
You've heard that before.
You have, but it's worth repeating. And then two is understand your own risk tolerance. How much volatility can you stomach?
Right.
Are you comfortable with, maybe losing some money in the short term in order to achieve long-term gains?
Because investing always involves some level of risk.
It does. And then finally, stay informed.
Yeah.
Keep learning about the world. Pay attention to economic trends. Don't be afraid to adjust your investment strategy as needed.
So be proactive. Don't be reactive. Don't wait for things to happen. Try to anticipate potential changes and then position yourself accordingly.
Right. And that's where Dalio's insights can be so helpful.
Okay. So we've talked about diversification. We've talked about risk tolerance. We've talked about staying informed.
Right.
But let's get into some more specific, investment strategies. What are some actual asset classes that Dalio suggests investors should consider in light of all this?
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned before, he likes assets that tend to perform well during periods of inflation.
Right.
So things like real estate, commodities, gold.
The classic inflation hedges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he also sees potential in emerging markets, particularly those that are, benefiting from China's rise.
So even though, the U.S. may be facing some headwinds,
Right.
there are still opportunities for growth
There are. Yeah.
in other parts of the world.
And that's why diversification is so important.
Okay. So we've got real estate, we've got commodities, we've got gold, we've got emerging markets. Anything else?
Yeah. He also talks about the importance of investing in innovation.
Okay.
So he believes that companies and countries that are leading the way in things like AI, biotech, renewable energy, those are the ones that are likely to outperform over the long term.
So it's not just about, picking individual stocks. It's about identifying the big trends.
Right.
the mega trends
Exactly.
that are shaping the future.
Yeah, and that's where Dalio's long-term perspective can really be helpful.
Okay, so, we've talked about a lot here, from diversification to inflation hedges to investing in innovation.
Right.
But there's one more big kind of looming question,
Oh,
I
yeah.
think.
Yeah.
And that's the future of the U.S. dollar.
Right.
And as we mentioned before, Dalio doesn't really come out and say definitively,
Right.
yes, the dollar's dominance is ending,
Right.
or no, it's not.
Yeah.
So how should investors kind of approach that uncertainty?
Yeah. That's a tough one. It's like trying to predict the weather
Right.
months in advance.
Sure.
Too many variables.
Right.
But, one thing that Dalio emphasizes is having a plan for different scenarios.
Okay.
So think about, what if the dollar does lose its reserve currency status?
Right.
How would you adjust your portfolio?
Right.
What are your options?
Have a contingency plan.
Have a contingency plan.
Yeah, plan B,
A plan B.
in case things don't go exactly the way we expect.
Right. And it's, like we said before, we're in uncharted territory here.
Yeah.
Nobody knows for sure what's going to happen.
But Dalio reminds us that, times of great change can also be times of great opportunity
They can.
for those who are prepared
Absolutely.
to adapt.
Yeah.
So, I think that's really the key message here is, be informed,
Right.
be adaptable,
Yeah.
be strategic.
Yeah,
And Dalio's work really gives you the tools to do that.
it does.
Okay, so I think this is a good place to pause for now.
Okay.
We've talked about a lot of the financial implications of Dalio's work.
Yeah.
Diversification, risk tolerance, all of that. But there's another, really interesting aspect of Dalio's thinking
Right.
that I think is worth exploring. And that's his kind of philosophy on, how to thrive as an individual in a changing world.
Absolutely.
Not just financially, but
Yeah.
personally and professionally.
Right.
So in the next part of our deep dive, we're gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about that. We're gonna dive into Dalio's advice for personal growth
Yeah.
and resilience in the face of change.
Yeah. And that's something that's relevant to everybody,
Absolutely.
regardless of, your financial situation or your investment strategy.
Right. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. We spent a lot of time talking about empires and economic cycles and, investment strategies.
Right.
And it's heavy stuff.
But is it?
If you really think about the potential for, global upheaval
Right.
and all the uncertainty,
Yeah.
it can feel a little bit overwhelming.
It's easy to get caught up in those doom and gloom scenarios.
Right.
But Dalio, he's not just predicting disaster.
Right.
He's actually quite optimistic about, humanity's ability to adapt and innovate. He believes we have the potential to solve our biggest challenges and create a better future.
So what's the secret? How do we, not only navigate these changes, but actually thrive in a world that's, constantly in flux?
Well, one of his core beliefs is that pain plus reflection equals progress.
Okay.
He argues that it's through facing challenges and, thinking about our mistakes that we really learn and grow.
So it's not about avoiding pain or trying to predict every twist and turn.
Right.
It's more about developing the resilience, the adaptability
Yeah.
to kind of bounce back and learn from those experiences.
Exactly.
So Dalio, he's a very specific framework
Yes.
for how to do this.
Yeah.
And he calls it his principles.
Right.
And, I've heard a lot about these principles over the years, and I feel like, people either love them or they think they're a little bit too rigid.
Right.
So what are they all about?
Well, they're basically, a distillation of his life experiences, the
Okay.
lessons he's learned along the way.
Right.
And, he's a very data-driven and analytical guy.
Yeah.
So he's really tried to systematize his approach to decision making.
Right.
And I think, the core of it is really about being honest with yourself about your weaknesses, embracing feedback, and constantly striving to learn and improve.
So it's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about having a growth mindset and being open to feedback, even if it's not always, easy to hear.
Exactly.
So how do these principles work in practice?
Well, one of his key principles is embrace reality and deal with it.
Okay.
Which sounds simple, but it's actually pretty profound.
Sure.
It's about accepting things as they are, even when they're not what you want them to be,
Right.
and then figuring out how to move forward.
That's easier said than done,
It is.
especially when you're dealing with, difficult situations.
Right.
But Dalio argues that it's essential for growth.
Yeah.
If you're constantly denying reality or
Yes.
trying to avoid pain, you're never going to learn from those experiences.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's about facing those fears, those challenges
Yeah.
head on, rather than trying to kind of sweep them under the rug.
Right.
And Dalio believes that, this approach can actually lead to greater happiness and fulfillment in the long run. It's
Yeah.
about finding meaning in those struggles
Right.
and using them as opportunities for growth.
Exactly.
That's powerful stuff.
It is.
It's not just about achieving financial success. It's really about developing, the inner strength and resilience
Yeah.
to deal with life's ups and downs.
Absolutely.
So even though we've been talking a lot about, empires
Right.
and geopolitics and economics,
Right.
it really does all come back to the individual
Yeah.
and their ability to adapt and thrive in a changing world.
Yeah. Well, I think that about wraps it up for our deep dive into Ray Dalio's world.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from, the historical patterns of empires
Right.
to the potential shift in power from
Yeah.
the US to China
Yeah.
to strategies for, navigating those changes.
Absolutely.
And even though we can't predict the future with certainty,
Right.
Dalio's work gives us a framework
It does.
for understanding the forces that are shaping the world.
Yeah.
And making more informed decisions.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, that's all we can really ask for.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to, continue to explore Dalio's work.
Right.
Keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Absolutely.
The world's constantly changing.
Yeah.
And the more we understand the forces that are driving those changes,
Right.
the better prepared we'll all be
Yeah.
to kind of navigate those uncharted waters.
Absolutely.
So until next time.